Redistricting has always been challenging, with parties in power gerrymandering to their benefit. This cycle was no different.
Florida has a clause that states redistricting is one of the only issues that does not require the process take place under the sunshine. And what that means is that it is not subject to public records requests. So it can take place in complete silence and in the shield of darkness in the state without voters and Floridians actually knowing what transpired during that time.
We chose to prioritize racial equity to lift up the voices of communities of color.
We don't see the needs of our communities actually being prioritized in the State House. And that's why this process was so important and why racial equity had to be centered in order to make sure we can have a legislature that is representative and responsive to the needs and the interests of the communities to which they serve.
Black and brown communities, a lot of us are not represented in a fair way. And so that was one of the things that we've learned through this process is to make sure that we are speaking on a collective level. That way we are taken very seriously about what we're talking about and what we're doing.
We rose to the challenge. We mobilized.
We turned out hundreds of people to hearings, to public hearings, to testimonies, to submitting testimonies. All of these folks are just regular people who are, rather they're going into work at a nursing home, or they're going to be a teacher, or they're working in a corporation. These are regular people showing up for the democracy.
People were there to mobilize and galvanize and host educational seminars and trainings, even in person. We even mobilized over 300 people to the Capitol and trained them on how to testify as well and holding these conversations with their elected leaders.
And our engagement made a difference.
We're seeing Texans, over 1,000 Texans from all across the state in over 8 different non-English languages coming and testifying either in person or virtually for their reason on why Texans deserved fair representation.
We started creating multilingual materials on redistricting in 5 different languages, and we conducted car tours to educate ourselves on the current boundaries.
Voices were heard in the process that were never heard before.
We didn't have an infrastructure. This was the first time in the state of Alabama's history that you had this sort of robust citizen-led involvement on the front end prior to the census data being released, and where you had the number of people being engaged in trainings.
We had more testimonies come out in legislative cycle than we've seen in a very long time because people felt empowered. They felt that somebody was saying, hey, no, you can give your testimony. You can give it verbally. You can write it down. And sometimes, yes, we know we only get a couple minutes to tell our story, but we can also help folks be able to learn how to tell that story in highlights. And sometimes that's the biggest thing, is just making people feel comfortable that they are invited to the table.
We built powerful coalitions.
API Vote was proud to have served as a member of the Coalition Hub Advancing Redistricting and Grassroots Engagement, or CHARGE, along with other key organizations with a national footprint.
One Voice has always been involved in the fight for fair maps in Mississippi. Our organizational approach from the beginning has been to work in coalition with our partners. We coordinate a state table with a number of our partners at the state, local, and national level, where we engage in, civic engagement activities, election protection, voter engagement.
And so we now have a community of foundations that are deeply engaged in this for a whole host of reasons. And we become a family of funders and of groups in the state and local level that are pursuing this really important task.
Maps were more equitable because of increased participation.
In New Mexico, we are one of the most diverse states. I think the reason our maps were equitable, it was the process of taking in consideration every single voice of our coalition. We were able to connect the whole narrative and find a commonality, right? And a commonality among us that at the end of the day, what we wanted is that the maps really represent the reality that we see in our neighborhoods.
Houston is a very segregated city, and but we made the commitment to make sure that we would come together in the end and make sure that we were defining the boundaries in a way that would help us have a collective, strong voice.
We know we can make the difference, so let's keep the fight going.
A lot of what our partners shared after the process is that now they have come away with a lot of collaborative relationships that they can continue to take away, not just for this year's redistricting process, not just for elections this cycle, but for the future cycles of redistricting.
Redistricting is just part of a larger fight for a multiracial democracy.
I am hopeful because I am seeing more orgs reframe redistricting as not this once in a decade issue, but as an issue that is interwoven into the year-round advocacy work that we all do around core community issues such as voting rights, healthcare, criminal justice, and other local issues.
When we think about what we are fighting for, when we are fighting for an anti-racist, welcoming democracy and welcoming place where all people can thrive no matter who they are, where they come from, what zip code they live in, etc., right? Redistricting is one of the foundational pieces.
What we built was a stronger movement for building power.
Hey folks, can you hear me? I heard that you all did not hear my speech. Just want to make sure you all can hear me okay. Perfect. Thank you all so much for joining the We Draw the Lines Coalition this evening. My name is Jasmine Burney Clark, founder and consulting director of Equal Ground Education Fund. We are Black-led, community-centered voting rights organization working to build Black political power across the state of Florida. We do that through voter registration, voter education, voter mobilization, and litigation. In 2010, the citizens of Florida of all races voted overwhelmingly to enact the Fair Districts Amendments to the state's constitution, imposing constraints on some of the worst abuses of partisan gerrymandering and racially discriminating congressional redistricting. Over the next decade, states across the country have followed Florida's lead by adopting similar policies, prompting the United States Supreme Court to cite the Fair Districts Amendments as an exemplar of provisions in both state statutes and state constitutions. And indeed, just 7 years ago, the Florida Supreme Court invalidated the legislature's congressional redistricting plan under the Fair Districts after finding partisan intent tainted the entire redistricting process. On behalf of the We Draw the Lines Coalition, made up of Equal Ground, the League of Women Voters, Black Voters Matter, Florida Rising, and Florida Watch, tonight we'd like to share some very important information and an update on Florida's redistricting lawsuit against the state of Florida ahead of the August 23rd primary election day and ways that you can get involved along the way. I'm now going to hand it over to Cecile Schoon, the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida.
Thank you, Jasmine. And on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Florida, we're thrilled to be a part of this coalition to bring education and inform all of our citizens. I want to talk to everyone a little bit about this word called redistricting, because people hear that word and they just go, oh, that's complicated. And in some ways it is, and in many ways it is not. Redistricting is basically drawing lines to show what people can vote for what particular candidate. And it lets the candidate know who they should be pitching their speeches to. So that's basically what that is. And we have redistricting every 10 years, and it comes after the census, United States Census, because you look to see which states have had growth in population and which have had lessening of population, because the total number we can have of congresspersons is 435. So if you lose population, you're probably going to lose a representative. This time, Florida grew in population and we got an extra representative. We went a congressional representative from 27 to 28. We also have redistricting that is done in the state for state representatives and state legislators. So it doesn't just happen on the federal level, it also happens on the state level. And in the state of Florida, our Senate and our representatives, the House of Representatives, they draw the lines. And over the years, we've had to monitor what the legislators do because sometimes if people are in power, they want to keep the power and they're not always following the rules properly. Some terms I would like you to remember and keep in mind is that when you have a population, particularly a minority population that has enough people in a particular area to select a representative of their choosing, and they draw the line mysteriously right in the middle, then that is called cracking, because then that community doesn't have enough people in a district to select somebody. There's another thing that we need to watch out for, and it's the opposite, and that's called packing. And that's when, for example, you might need about a certain percentage to elect somebody, a representative of your choice. And that percentage, we'll call it N. And they actually put 2N, twice as many, in that particular district. And that those votes are wasted because you didn't need them to be packed in there. They could have been in other districts influencing elections. So that's called packing. We don't like either one of those things. And we call those actions gerrymandering, which is a negative and bad way to draw redistricting lines. What happens when you draw redistricting lines in packing and cracking and gerrymandering? It allows extremes to rule. It causes people to not want to negotiate because they don't have to deal with people different in their district and their community. So they go, I can't hear you. And we see that a lot. So that is not good. I want to talk to you also a little bit about some of what's going on in Florida. Florida worked really hard in the early 2000s, and in 2010, we passed a constitutional amendment called our Fair Districts Amendment. And that was a culmination of a lot of partners working together. And guess what that did? That put in the Florida Constitution, you cannot gerrymander, you cannot draw unfair lines. And it specifically prohibited political gerrymandering, which is to favor one party over the other. And it also specifically prohibited diminishing the voting power of minorities once they were established, either a racial or language minority. So it had some really, really good protections in there. And it also said it must be contiguous. And so those are mandatory requirements. Then there was another set of requirements that if we could have them, we would like them. But they would always defer to the mandatory if the mandatory needed to be kept. And so we like them to be compact as possible. We don't like them strung out as compact as we can be. We like to take into account, is it one city or another city, jurisdictional lines? And we like to take into account jurisdictional boundaries because it's difficult for people going over lakes and mountains and so on. And so those passed by over 63%. And in Florida, we have something wonderful, and it's called direct democracy. This constitutional amendment came directly from the citizens of Florida and was very popular. Well, after it passed, the legislator promised that they would abide by these new laws and they would not favor one side or the other politically or racially. They said they would do that. They promised the people that. But when we looked, the league and others looked at the way the maps were drawn, that's not the way it worked out. The maps seemed to be extremely harmful to minorities and seemed to favor one party over the other. So there was a legal challenge that the league was involved with. The league sued along with many other partners, the Fair Districts Coalition and others. And we won after a very lengthy litigation. We won, and the Florida Supreme Court said that the Fair Districts amendments were lawful and they must be abided. And the then Republican legislators, they were the ones, predominant party that had done the gerrymandering back in 2010, they actually admitted that they had done that intentionally. They did that in court. And those papers are in court to be seen by anybody. Well, guess what? It's 2020, and it was time for the census again. Census was delayed a little bit, but we got our report, and that's how we got our extra representative. And we all the partners said to the legislators, please follow Fair Districts laws. We want fairness. We don't want packing. We don't want cracking. And they all agreed, we're going to do that. And initially, it looked as though the representatives were going, and the senators were going to follow their promise and follow the law. But in the end, they capitulated and abdicated their responsibility and basically adopted a map that was presented and pushed on them by Governor DeSantis. But it was the legislators that adopted it. They literally sent a press release saying, we're going to do whatever the governor says. And it was their duty and their lawful obligation to draw proper maps. So now we're in a situation where, again, with our partners, we are in litigation to enforce our Fair Districts amendments. And we are determined to make sure that the maps are drawn fairly. And if we need the court's intervention to do so, that's what we had to do before. And we are working with our partners that are presenting this afternoon to get that done. And so it's a little bit of deja vu, but we're not going to give up, and we're going to fight to make sure that every citizen's vote is counted properly and the districts are drawn fairly. Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce you to another one of our partners. I'd like to introduce you to Monet Holder, who is a Senior Director of Advocacy and Programs at Florida Rising, one of the 4 plaintiffs that Ms. Clark mentioned. Go ahead, Monet.
Thank you so much, Cecile, for that context and providing the deep history of the redistricting fight here in the state of Florida. Once again, my name is Monet Holder, and I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy and Programs at Florida Rising Together. Florida Rising Together is a 501c3 organization dedicated to advancing economic and racial justice across the state by building power in historically marginalized communities. Our organization develops leaders that will help shift power so communities get to decide their own destinies. I don't think we can reiterate enough that the congressional districting plan that was passed by the legislature deeply diminishes Black representation in the state. But the portions of Florida that are most directly impacted are Congressional District 5 in North Florida, Congressional District 9, Congressional District 10, and Congressional District 7 in Central Florida, Congressional District 13 and 14 in Tampa Bay, and Congressional District 26 and 27 in South Florida. For 30 years, the North Florida community, which is my community, has been able to elect a member of Congress who we knew would work for us and understood the issues we face every day as Black Floridians. However, Governor Ron DeSantis' rigged congressional maps changed that. Our community has now been divided, meaning that we will no longer have a member of Congress who we can count on to fight for us and who we know has our best interests at heart. Since 2016, Central Florida has had the opportunity to elect members of Congress who represent their views. Now, not only were our Black communities able to elect representatives who were responsive to their needs, but everyone could stand together in districts that reflected the diversity of the region to elect people who folks knew put their best interests first. Now the people of Central Florida will have their voices diluted. Following the drawing of the lines in 2015, Floridians in Tampa Bay have had the opportunity to elect representatives that reflect their values on both sides of the bridge. By keeping the Black community whole in St. Petersburg, they could play a significant role in deciding who represented the city and southern part of the county by making Black voices heard in competitive elections where their concerns were front and center. While in Tampa, the Black community there had a major voice in who represented a large part of the city in the halls of Congress. Governor Ron DeSantis has chosen, however, to dilute that power by packing and cracking, which are two terms that Cecile mentioned earlier, Black communities on either side of Tampa Bay into an unconstitutional gerrymander that silences thousands of voters. Lastly, as we take a look at South Florida, the vibrant diversity of that community has always been reflected in the competitive and tough election of our candidates for Congress when they had to run. We always knew the concerns of South Florida would be taken into account because we knew that our elected representatives were listening, due to the fact that these seats could swing at any time. Unfortunately, though, Governor Ron DeSantis has taken steps to dilute the power of our votes and put our future political power at risk. By treating our Latinx communities as pieces of a partisan gerrymandered chessboard, he has proven that he won't stop at just eliminating the voices of Black Floridians. So I challenge you, as we head to the polls this August and November, we must not only be mindful of the newly formed gerrymandered districts in which we live in, we must keep in mind the importance of electing leaders who represent our interests every single day. And with that, I'll hand it over to Olivia Mendoza, one of the attorneys on our legal team on this litigation.
Thank you, Monet. My name is Olivia Mendoza. I'm the Deputy Director of Litigation and Policy here at the National Redistricting Foundation. And our organization is supporting the individual voter plaintiffs as well as the community-based organizations who we've heard speak here tonight. And what I wanted to do, take a few brief moments here to talk about, now that we have the historical context that Cecile provided and a deeper understanding of what the map did from Monet's summary, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit in more detail about what the lawsuit is that we are currently, that the plaintiffs are currently alleging is discriminatory based on all the information that you've heard. So this lawsuit alleges that the new congressional plan, so this is specific to the congressional plan, that it actually violates several of the provisions of the Florida Constitution that Cecile mentioned in the Fair Districts Amendments. Now, the defendants in this case include the Secretary of State in the official capacity, and the Florida House of Representatives and the Florida Senate. So again, I think that's important to notice that those are the defendants, although it is a map that was advocated for and publicly shared by the governor, that this was his plan and what he wanted. It was, in effect, the legislature that passed it, and that was their responsibility to pass a map, and they did pass the DeSantis map. So they are the defendants. The case was filed in the Circuit Court of Leon County, and initially our case was heard before Judge Lane Smith. That judge has now rotated out, and so now the case is filed in front of Judge Lee Marsh. So let me talk to you a little bit about the claims that are being brought in this litigation. And I think one way to think about the full case is to think about the case itself as a tree with a lot of limbs on it. And each limb is essentially a legal claim that the plaintiffs are bringing. So the first legal claim is under alleging a violation under Tier 1 of the Florida Constitution under the Fair Districts Amendments that essentially prohibits retrogression. And what that means is that it can't diminish the districts that current communities of color or protected districts like Black and Latino voters that they currently have the ability to elect, those cannot be diminished. And the claim alleges that this DeSantis plan, in fact, does that. And most egregiously can be seen in District 5, where that, as Monet mentioned, was previously an ability to elect district for Black voters, and will be determined to see if that is still the case. The other tree limb, another claim that that the plaintiffs are alleging, is in regard to the prohibition against intentional discrimination or racial gerrymandering, as Cecile mentioned, where the map is, really manipulated in a way that either is cracking or packing Black voters in a way that dilutes their vote. And you can really see that happening in the Tampa Bay and Central Florida area. The third claim is still a Tier 1 claim, and this is an allegation that the map violates the prohibition against intentional gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. And so again, here the DeSantis congressional plan, really statewide, was drawn with the intent to favor the Republican Party. And the next claim is a Tier 2 claim. And what that means, in the Florida Districts Amendments, the amendments themselves were prioritized by Tier 1 or Tier 2. And so the first three that I went through are Tier 1 allegation or claims, and now the last two are Tier 2 violations, and that includes that the map unnecessarily split to the districts in a manner that it did not need to do, including splitting political and geographic boundaries. And then the other Tier 2 claim is that the districts are not compact. And those, again, are the 5 claims, if you will, that are before the court. And the plaintiffs are asking the court to declare or had filed a preliminary injunction asking the court to declare the congressional plan unconstitutional and in violation of the Florida Constitution, specifically as to the very first tree limb that I mentioned to you, and that was the retrogression claim in CD5. So all of the full claims were still, before the court. but the plaintiffs asked the court specifically to look at the violation of the Fair Districts Amendments in the retrogression of CD5 and sought a preliminary injunction under that claim. So I'm just going to jump over there very quickly and kind of back to that tree limb to say that there was a lot of back and forth in the district court, and there was a lot of procedural decisions to track. But essentially on May 11th, the merits case, like the evidence, the information of the case was presented to the judge in the court, and the court agreed with the plaintiffs and said, in fact, yes, this plan violates the Fair Districts Amendments. This plan is unconstitutional. And there began the back and forth between the Court of Appeals and the district court, where in a series of back and forths between May 13th and June 17th, the DeSantis plan was declared unconstitutional, and then on procedural questions. So again, not on questions of the merits of the case, but on procedural questions, the court allowed the DeSantis plan to stay in place. And so that's where we are today, where for the 2022 elections, the DeSantis plan is in place. However, as Jasmine and Monet and Cecile have mentioned, the fight continues on the full merits of the case. And I think the last thing that I want to leave you with is I know that there's going to be conversations about what can people do? Like, where does this leave us? And I will say that the popularity of the Fair Districts Amendments is clear. Broad popularity of passage of these amendments, not just for Florida voters, but across the country. And the importance of the state judicial system to uphold the rights of Floridians cannot be underscored. And I think it's really integral that we are always thinking about what the judges' roles are in any kind of litigation, and really looking for judges who will uphold the constitutional requirements, regardless of partisan politics. And that applies to just a good general citizenry and, ensuring that the courts are, in fact, impartial. And so with that, I think that is the summary of the status of the case currently, and I will turn it over to Jasmine.
Perfect. Thank you for providing that excellent summary. We'll now hand it over to Jamil to provide us with an update on a portion of our next steps.
Thank you, Jasmine. Good evening, everyone. Once again, my name is Jamil Davis, and I am the Florida State Organizing Manager for Black Voters Matter. In 2020, Black voters delivered unprecedented turnout at the polls and risked everything, including their own health at the height of the pandemic, just to vote. Now, as we enter the midterm season, dangerous Supreme Court decisions and a wave of state-level voter restrictions threaten to turn back the clock on election freedom, to undermine our ability to build power, and to stop our gains on the issues impacting our communities. Join our movement and continue to fight for voting rights at the federal, state, and local levels. Text FAIR Districts to 52886 to make your pledge to vote and hold leaders accountable in our communities. We'll get back to you with voter registration info and ways to volunteer in your area. We know that the right to vote is at the core of any functioning democracy. If America truly believes in democracy, we must all stand up for it, and that begins with securing the right to vote for everyone. Do your part to take a stand and seal it with a pledge. Text FAIR Districts to 52886 and stay connected. Thank you, and Jasmine, back to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Now for the special announcement portion of tonight's conversation and event. We are excited to share that we are not only going to help guide folks through the process of understanding fair districts in our state and the fact that we have a right to them, but we are also going to prepare to meet you in your community where you are at, specifically in the impacted districts laid out by our attorney and Monet this evening. We Draw the Line is headed on tour across the state of Florida. We will be visiting you all in your communities. We will take the time to talk directly about the lawsuit. We will talk a little bit about your specific districts. We will talk about what the map looked like previously and what we are contending and what you should be doing locally to make sure that your voice can be heard as we wait for litigation to proceed in the state of Florida. We know that fair districts, again, are a right. It is something that our state residents have required of our state government in 2010, and we want to ensure that every resident has access to fair districts. As Jamil said, you can follow the process and join us at one of the tour stops along the state of Florida by texting fair districts, all one word, to 52886. Again, fair districts to 52886. And you can visit us at, again, one of the multiple tour stops. We will be headed on August 30th to Seminole County, Congressional District 7, specifically to kick off this tour at the end of this month. On September the 7th, we will be headed to Orange County, Congressional District 10. On September 12th, Congressional District 9 in Osceola County. September 13th, Congressional District 13 in Tampa Bay. September 14th, Congressional District 14 in Tampa Bay. And then on September 15th, we will be headed to Congressional District 26 and 27 in Miami-Dade. And then we will end our tour on October 6th in Congressional District 5 in Duval County. Again, we want to make sure that we talk directly to those who are directly impacted by our state's maps. We also want voters to know that the MAPS process is not final and the decision is ultimately in the hands of the court, but we draw the lines when it comes to our voting power and when it comes to fair districts in this state. I want to say on behalf of our partners, Florida Rising, the League of Women Voters, Black Voters Matter, Florida Watch, the National Redistricting Foundation, thank you for joining us. And we hope that you'll join us on one of these tour stops across the state of Florida as we fight and advocate for fair maps ahead of the midterm elections. Thank you and have a great evening.